Alright guys, so bringing you up to speed on doing the rack and pinion on our PT Cruiser GT. Some of it earlier was a little bit hard to get video footage of or pictures. We started on it last night, and then really up in here it's really hard to see with the camera. It's hard to see just yourself in general. So what we got here is we had to actually drop the subframe on this one, which really isn't too bad. On each side there's a total of 3 24mm bolts. Go up to the body. One goes through the rear of the lower control arm. Those ones go up there. And then we did undo the both of the bolts at the knuckle on each side. We left the CV shafts in, so we don't have to mess with that. And you want to be careful with that because you don't want to end up hyperextending one side. We haven't had any problems with that. And then we got left the brake lines and all the calipers on. They are kind of pulled to the max right now, but nothing to actually damage anything. There's the 2 lines that go into the rack and pinion. We were only able to actually get to those after we had this subframe lowered down a little bit. Those are both 18mm. It's preferred we use a 18mm line wrench on it, help keep from rounding them off. You can use a regular one sometimes, but it's a good little insurance. And there's a couple electrical connectors you have to undo from like the steering pressure sensor on the rack. Then there's a total of 4 15mm bolts to hold the rack to the subframe. Here we have our new one. You can see 2 of them just go straight to the subframe. The other one has this isolated bushing mount. Those ones we actually got 2 coming from the top from the engine bay side. Underneath it's just real hard to get to them. If we had waited till we had the subframe down a little more, might have had a little bit more room to do it. But a couple extensions go from the top. It's a little difficult if you have a helper. It helps a lot, someone underneath to help you get you lined up on them. But once you do that, that's really not bad at all. One interesting thing on this one is the steering shaft where it goes in. You have to actually kind of push this boot down when it is in the car. And then it has, a lot of them have a cinch bolt that goes through. This one actually uses a roll pin that presses through. We just got a long screwdriver in there and just have someone kind of hold the steering wheel, because where you have to have it positioned on the shaft to get through in there to pound it out when the rack and pinion is still in there. And then just have them hold the steering wheel so you can pound that through. That's what it goes through on there. Really not too bad though. And then it just slides right out. After you once you have that out, you can fully undo your total of 6 bolts for the subframe to lower it down. We just have one low profile jack under the center, kind of just to keep it supported and to be able to lower it down and lift it up. Like I said, we still have the CVs and everything in there, so it can't go real far. Don't have to do anything with the sway bar or anything. It all stays there. So really it's a fairly simple job on this one. This takes a little bit of time. Another thing we had to do is on the passenger side. You don't have one on the driver's side, but on the passenger side, going up in here on your car, there'll be a torque mount as well. Yours will probably look a little different than this one. This is an upgraded one from Black Path. We're actually going to be doing some modifications on it where it slightly rubs. We don't really like that. Anyways, there's 2 bolts up here to undo that, and then there's this one brace that comes from the chassis down to the subframe. Just undo those as well. But other than that, this side is identical to the driver's side. Still the same 3 24mm bolts that go up through. We're going to stop and do a little more cleaning on here before we put the new one in. We're going to cover up these lines and actually spray this out because this thing's been leaking for quite a while. So try to get it as clean as we can before we put it back together. And then on the reassembly process, we'll show you a little bit more, and as well as getting the new outer tie rod ends on. It's no better time than now to change those. These ones are pretty tired, so we're going to get this cleaned up and we'll go back to the assembly. Alright, so what we have is with our roll pin, we had to press out to get the rack off the steering shaft. Now we have the steering shaft back onto the steering gear up in there. Takes a little bit to get it lined up right, and then it really helps if you have someone else to kind of sit inside and kind of slightly wiggle the steering wheel. while you jack up the whole subframe and get those to meet together. Then you can lightly get the shaft from up inside the car and kind of encourage it down a little bit for the last bit. But with our pin, we did is just on one end we did a little slight taper with the grinder, then went over it with the file, and then we'll grease that up, and that'll help us get it started back in through there. So a lot of times, sometimes, especially on a limited space, it's hard to get the roll pin to start off. Just keep smacking it around. So this will allow you to put it in a little bit easier without compromising it while it's in the car. Alright, so now we are removing the old tie rod ends from the old rack and pinion. We have new ones on our car, but we're taking these off so I can count the turns on these ones so I know where they were set to the old rack and pinion. That way when I'm putting the new tie rods on our new rack, we should have a pretty close setup for our alignment, at least close enough that we can get it to our alignment shop without doing any damage to it. And our lock nut for the outer tie rod is a size crescent. There we go. We'll do it Sesame Street style. 1, 2, 3. That's great. So that's how it happens. Anyways, roughly 34.5. Alright, so just as a secondary form of measurement, the other one measured it just inch-wise with the tie rod off going back to where the nut is. That one is directly at 2 1/4 inches. So I'm going to back this one off. And that'll just ensure that I was correct on my turns and that it is set up as close as it can be to how it was. We'll thread our new tie rod on. Do that. That's one turn. So we're supposed to be roughly 34.5. So we'll see here. So back up to this. That's probably our half right there. Muy perfecto, señorita. So on the stud on your tie rod, where it goes back through the knuckle, after you get it tightened up, there's a small eyelet hole in it, and that's to slide your cotter pin into. Sometimes you'll have to tighten the nut a little bit more, or possibly back it off just a hair to get it to align in the castle nut with the hole for the cotter pin. The most traditional way is to slide the cotter pin in with it sideways facing, so both the wings of it will fold around that way. I usually just put them in like that. It's not going anywhere, it's making sure the nut doesn't turn. Simpler for me, so that's up to you.
The sexy man.
As you can see over here.
It's going.
Ah, okay.